Well, I hope you're doing well. Thanks for joining us today. So, I don't know about you, but as I was growing up, when I would have to stay home from school, maybe stay home for, I was sick during the day, there is nothing like daytime TV. It is the worst, actually. And I can remember some shows, especially around lunchtime or, in the morning, The Price is Right. Everybody watches The Price is Right. And then the afternoon time, it would usually start off with, I actually remember watching The People's Court. The People's Court with Judge Wapner. Do you remember Judge Wapner? Ah, man. And I can remember when the plaintiffs would walk in, or those who were part of they were being tried or whatever, as they would come in, it would type across the screen who they were and what they were accusing so-and-so of doing. And then when the judge would walk in, the guard would say, "All rise." And so everybody would stand, and just this incredible moment, right? And after it was over, of course, as they're leaving the courtroom, there would be this guy or someone who was out there, like a reporter, asking them questions, Do you think it was fair? Do you think you got treated fair? How do you feel about what the judge said? Or even, will you ever talk to your mom again? It was that good. I remember watching it. And as I've gotten older, and I've gone back, and they've changed the show a little bit over the years, but now they have this thing where people will watch like real time or watching from a video of the courtroom and what's going on in there. And they will ask people, like when they come back from a commercial, they'll ask them, what do you think should happen here? Do you think that they should, what do you think the judge should say? And people actually give their thoughts and opinions about what the judgment should be. I think it's really interesting. I'm like, why do we do this? Why do we air our dirty laundry in front of everybody? Why do we bring this on more than what we have to in our everyday lives? Like, it feels like we're always kind of facing this stuff in our own lives. Why do we need to do it like that, right? But the truth is, how we treat each other and how we see each other, it seems like there's always something underneath. There's always something behind and below the surface when it comes to the way we see other people. There are always reasons why we think what we think about them. Maybe it's something that is connected to pain in our own lives or the pain we experience from people who are like them. Maybe it's connected to our own insecurities. And so we project in order to distract from our flaws. More often than not, how we view others is a direct reflection of how we really view ourselves. But let me take it a little bit further. And especially for those of us who have faith and believe in God and follow Jesus, see, how we view other people directly reflects what we really believe about God. So over these last couple of months, we've been talking about the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' famous sermon that he shared with his closest disciples. If you remember how it all started off, he called his disciples around him to hear what he had to say, and even there were people around him. And you might say that Jesus wasn't just talking to the disciples, he was also talking to the people of Israel, the people who were supposed to be God's representative of his presence in this world. And he's trying to awaken within them a spirit that would open their eyes to see who Jesus really is, who he really is. He's trying to get them to see all of this, that everything that they had learned, everything that they heard about, even back to the story of when God brought the people of Israel out of Egypt and how God created a people, like he created the people of Israel to reveal his presence. All of it is coming into a new form of revelation Jesus is trying to get them to see. And that new form of revelation, Jesus is saying he is the new revelation of God. So now he says that if you are going to call yourselves my followers, if you are going to believe that I am the Messiah, the one God, the God or creator of all the world, the one that God has sent to rescue the world, if you are going to accept me, then you also have to embrace this new way to live. Because, see, Jesus' new way to live is meant to help us directly reflect the presence of God in our world. God is on a mission to rescue the world from self-destructing. God is on a mission to set people free from the chains of oppression. God is on a mission to set people free from the guilt and shame of racism and greed and sex trafficking and pornography. And listen, any other sin that distorts the beauty of the image of God on every living human. God has come, and he's on a mission to rescue us. That's why Jesus says it all comes back to this. Do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. That's what he says. But here's the deal. We find in all these other words that in his sermon, what exactly he means by that simple phrase. It's why marriage and the extreme importance of this holy connection between two people, it's why that matters. It's why he says not to even hate with your heart or allow yourself to devalue another human being. We find it in the prayer that he teaches to them. If we don't practice forgiveness for those around us, then don't expect God's forgiveness for our wrongdoings. We find it when he talks about not judging. We find it when he talks about how and who to love. Even as he says, we have to love our enemies. We see all of this in Jesus' words that lead up to the way we should treat others. But I was thinking about this. I was thinking about that simple phrase about do to others as whatever you want them to do to you. But the reality is, do we even know? See, before you can treat others the way you should, you have to come to grips with the truth of how God has treated you. This means it's incredibly important to know the truth about God, to know how God sees us, to understand how God wants to help us. This is why Jesus has come. He has come to help us know the truth about God. Listen, Jesus is the truth about God. So if Jesus is the truth about God, then the words of Jesus are pointing us toward what is most important to God. And throughout Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, we find a thread. See, in the words of Jesus, it's obvious that our relationship with God is heavily dependent on how we relate with each other. Let me say that one more time. Listen. In the words of Jesus, it's obvious that our relationship with God is heavily dependent on how we relate to each other. But let's take a look here. We spent a lot of time on Jesus' words over these last several weeks. But I think it's important to also look at Jesus' actions. Not just that that's what Jesus said, but also that's what Jesus did. There's a story in the book of John in the New Testament. It's a unique story, but it's an incredible window into what Jesus' words look like when they're actually lived out. The religious leaders of Jesus' day had been watching him, and they had been trying to trick him and trap him. They had been judging everything he did and everywhere he went and all the people he hung out with. Everything was like under a microscope, and they were judging him. And so they set a trap for him. Let's read these words here in John chapter 8. So it says, Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives. But early the next morning, he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. And as he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his fingers. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. Powerful story, right? Here's this poor woman who has been shamed in front of everyone. And who knows how this all really came about. It says that they caught her in the act of adultery, which makes you wonder, why in the world were they watching? I mean, from the get-go, the nasty intentions are on full display. It doesn't take much to see they were trying to trap Jesus. And here is this moment. Jesus knows what the law is. The law is that if a woman is caught in adultery, if she's caught sleeping with someone other than her spouse, then she's supposed to be stoned. But guess what? There's also another part of that law that says if the other person who's involved in that same act of adultery, they are caught, then he's supposed to be stoned too. But these guys, they bring the woman to be stoned or to trap Jesus with, but there's no man who was also involved with this act to be found. It takes two to commit an act of adultery. This is just mean. But it's a great reminder of what can happen when we allow our hearts and our motives to go unchecked. See, their hatred for Jesus revealed they had no love for this woman. And they did not see any true value in even her life. It's a gut check for us, especially as we get into this really polarized season of the election year, right? Everybody's favorite. But the reality is that we have to keep our motives in check because it's too easy to slip into a judgmental, irrational state of mind, which allows us to devalue other human beings. It's too easy. We should commit right now that over this next entire year, we need to keep coming back to the words and the actions of Jesus. We have to let the words of Jesus shine a light on our motives. Before we post or repost or share a post on social media, and I will tell you right now, the amount of untruths that are on social media and floating around out there. In fact, this week I know of like 2 or 3 posts that I had to go and Google just to find out that they weren't true. And that my Christian friends were sharing and claiming they were truth. Don't allow your hatred for other people to cause you to forget about the truth. So these guys in this story, some of them are old enough to know better. They had forgotten the heart of the very God that they claimed to have given them the law in the first place. So much so that they could not even see God standing right there in front of them. So Jesus then bends down into the dirt and he begins to write something. Nobody really knows what he wrote. There's lots of speculation. Is there some kind of comparison that when he was writing with his fingers in the dust, was it compared to like when God wrote the 10 Commandments and he wrote it on the stone tablets? Was he writing down all the sins of those guys to show them up and to just remind them that, hey, look, you've got some flaws too? Who knows? But then Jesus stands up. After they had been trying to get him to give them an answer, what should we do about this woman? She's been caught in doing this terrible act. And Jesus shares these powerful, powerful words. Let the first one, who's never done anything wrong in the sight of God, you go ahead and throw the first rock. If you've got such a clean record in your life, that a clean conscience, that you have no flaws, that you've not ever done anything wrong in the sight of God, go ahead. Be the first one to throw a rock. And then Jesus stoops down again and starts doing stuff in the dust. I would love to have been there for that moment, right? For those gotcha moments. What are they going to do about it? But I would have hated to see that poor lady. See, in one swift sentence, Jesus has taken the spotlight off the woman and pointed right back at every one of those guys. They thought they were so smart and so smooth. They had been judging Jesus, but now the eye of justice is upon them. Frankly, I think Jesus was pretty graceful to them to give them a chance to walk away before they did something really stupid. But the most beautiful moment in this whole story is in the ending. Each of those guys walk away, oldest to the youngest, until it's just Jesus and that accused woman. There she stands in all of her guilt and all of her shame exposed in front of the whole world. And here was Jesus. Here's Jesus' chance to tell her how bad she is and how wrong she is and all the bad things that she's done. She deserves it, right? Jesus can get up and tell her, because if Jesus doesn't tell her how bad she is, nobody else will, right? Nobody else will tell her. But that's not what he does. Jesus stands up and he says, where have all your accusers gone? Didn't any of them condemn you? Didn't any of them throw a stone at you? Couldn't any of them have passed judgment on you? And she says, no, Lord. I find that interesting that she refers to him as Lord. She knows who Jesus is. And then Jesus responds, neither do I. And let me paraphrase the last part of what he says. He says, go and live differently. Versions say, go and sin no more. But I'm going to say he's saying, go and live differently. It's not that Jesus doesn't care about the sin in our lives. He cares deeply. But the reason he cares is because it will destroy us. It is self-destructing when we do things and act certain ways and think in ways that harm ourselves and others. Jesus does not condemn us, right? Jesus does not condemn us. He calls us into a new way of living. And the new way of living he calls us into is found through his words, the words of his Sermon on the Mount that we've been talking about. Pastor Duncan talked last week, the final words of the Sermon on the Mount found in chapter 7 of the book of Matthew. It says, anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds a house on solid rock. Though the rain comes in and torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse because it is built on bedrock. But anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on sand. When the rains and the floods come and the winds beat against the house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. I've said this many, many times, that the words of Jesus, they are challenging. In fact, these words will cut to the heart of us. His words will always go right to the why behind what we do, the why behind our actions, right? And if it was up to us, we could never do it by ourselves. In fact, I've thought many times, who can live like this? How in the world will I ever be able to live up to Jesus' expectation? But listen, don't let that does not let us off the hook. Because Jesus has promised not only would we have help through his Spirit, who is right now very much in our world, but we would also be able to share our lives with others just like Jesus. The story of the woman caught in adultery, it's a powerful reminder of how God sees us. So as we come back to the heart of the Sermon on the Mount, as we remember Jesus' words about doing to others whatever we would want them to do to us, remember the words of Jesus, what he says to the woman whose sin, all of her baggage, all of her ugliness has been laid out full display for everybody to see. He says, where are your accusers? Can no one accuse you? Neither do I. There is no condemnation in Jesus. No more guilt, no more shame. Only a calling to live differently by the power of Jesus' love. in our gatherings, we take a moment every week to spend a time in reflection. So I'm going to ask you to bow your heads, close your eyes for a moment as I ask you a few questions. And I want you to listen, to think about maybe the different moments in this gathering that Jesus has spoken to you. Maybe in this story of the woman caught in adultery. Where do you see yourself in this story? Can I tell you something? Wherever it is that you see, what matters the most is that right now, in this moment, you realize how Jesus sees you, how God sees you. And now that you realize that, as you begin to allow that just to flood your life, you hear the words of Jesus saying, I do not condemn you. Now that you hear that and you realize it, do you hear him calling you to live differently? No more condemnation, no more guilt, no more shame. Only the voice of Jesus calling us, calling you to live a new life through the power of Jesus' love. Let's pray together. God, thank you. Thank you for not just giving us words, but also giving us examples of how this looks. Thank you for your son, Jesus, who stepped into our world and was willing to go to a cross. Thank you for the power of your love that brought him back to life, and for the power of your Holy Spirit who can fill us and show us and lead us into the way that Jesus is calling us. Father, I pray that if there's anyone listening to this right now, that they would say yes to your calling. Yes to the new way of living. In your name I pray.
Hi, my name is Aaron Horton. I'm the lead pastor here at Pineville Church, and we are so glad that you joined us today. If you live in the Charlotte area, we'd like for you to come and join us in person on the weekends, on Sundays at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. We have our worship gatherings, and we have lots of different ministries that are happening throughout the week, and we'd love for you to be a part of the life of our church. If you're outside the Charlotte area and you're watching, we're so glad you're part of our online family. There's a way that you can connect with us. Maybe if you want to let us know how we can pray with you or pray for you, you can email us at nextsteps@pineville.church. Again, my name is Aaron Horton. So glad you joined us today at Pineville Church, where we want to be known for love.